Hello, everyone, our dear participants. I hope you have been enjoying so far the presentations and the lectures. And you may recall that during the last couple of days, several speakers already mentioned the tectonic shift of the point of gravity of Christianity towards South. And it really was signaled by the scholar Walbert Bellman in his publication Coming of the Third Church back in 1974 in German and then in English in 78. By the end of the 20th century, the scholars started paying attention to another reality, and such scholars as Andrew Walls, Philip Jenkins, Robert Schreiter, among the other, they started talking about the global church or global Christianity. And today we have with us a scholar whose major field of interest is in that area, Dr. Jehu Hanciles, who is the D.W. and Ruth Brooks Professor of World Christianity and director of the Candler's World Christianity Program, which is a Candler School of Theology in Emory University. Previously, Dr. Hanciles directed the Center for Missiological Research at Fuller Theological Seminary. And he also as an associate editor of one of the key journals in missiological journals, which is Missiology, an international quarterly review. Dr. Jehu Hanciles has written and edited a number of books and other scholarly publications, among which I would like to draw your attention to such books as Migration and the Making of Global Christianity, published in 2021, as well as World Christianity, History, Methodologies, and Horizons, published in the same book, and this is the edited volume. Dr. Hanciles has accomplished his PhD thesis in the University of Edinburgh, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, under the leadership of Dr. Andrew Walls.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. And so today's lecture, its title is Beyond Empire: The Migration Factor in Global Christianity. So without further ado, I invite Dr. Hanciles to deliver his lecture. So the floor is yours, Dr. Hanciles. Thank you for your time and for your readiness to share with us your wisdom and your expertise.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm sharing my screen now. Can you confirm that you can see it? Very good, and I assume you can hear me. Let me say once again, it's a privilege to be invited to participate in the Summer Institute. Interestingly, I should have asked Xenia about the other speakers, and when she showed the introduction slides, I saw many familiar names, and it made me realize that some of the comments I might make today may already be familiar to you, because you've been listening to some of the top scholars in the field of migration study from both biblical, theological, and historical perspectives. But okay, that being said, let me get on with what I want to share with you. Let me see if I can get my slide. Okay, so these are details you may already be familiar with. By 2020, according to UN estimates, there were 281 million international migrants in the world. This is the highest number of people living abroad in recorded history. If they all lived in the same place, that place would be the world's fourth largest country. But I want to make a comment at this early stage. Friends, when it comes to human migration, cold statistical data never tells the whole story. Statistics can never convey an accurate picture of the phenomenon. This is because migrant data is always incomplete, and also because the numbers represent horrendous, often hidden cases of human suffering, ruined lives, and an unimaginable pain. So consider that in 2019, 40% of the over 108 million people forcibly displaced worldwide were children. And in fact, in 2019, nearly one person was displaced every 2 seconds as a result of conflict or persecution. Now, this extraordinary data on the phenomenal levels of migration and displacement in our time may leave the impression that this situation is new. That is simply not true. The scale of human migration is unprecedented, but the reality is not. And to be honest with you, I state this as every opportunity. Human migration is a fact of history. As long as human beings have inhabited the planet, relocation, displacement, and population transfers have marked the human condition. Believe it or not, in human history, taken as a whole, migration, a permanent settlement is an exception. Migration has been a constant and influential feature of the human condition. More relevant, the global religious landscape is largely the product of complex migration movements. This is something I'm sure you are aware of already. Migrants do not take everything with them, but they take a lot, including their ideas, beliefs, religious practices, and spirituality. So all the world's major religions fundamentally owe their global presence, the worldwide spread of their belief systems, to extensive and escalating movements of peoples. But I want to argue today that Christianity is primary exhibit of the role of migration in the global expansion of faith, because migration is not simply incidental to the Christian story. Migration is intrinsic to the Christian faith and inseparable from Christian mission in a way that is far more prominent, I would argue, than in other religious traditions. And also because migration is integral to the biblical tradition. You may have heard this already from other speakers, so forgive me if I'm repeating something you heard previously. But the fact remains that we encounter every major form of migration in the biblical account. You could make a very strong case that the biblical story and message would be meaningless without migration and mobility. From a biblical perspective, migration emerges as both a metaphor for the life of faith and a distinct feature in divine action. So, American historian Timothy Smith, many decades ago, put it this way: migration, he's describing the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament record. He stated migration was a theologizing experience. What he means by that is that migration was in so many ways theologically transformative for the people of God, because it exposed those who were displaced to spiritual, emotional, and psychological aspects of truth that were not previously evident. And it tends to strip faith down to its essentials in a way that increases the potential for self-discovery and spiritual growth. I would add that at least two major insights emerge when we explore migration from a biblical perspective. Again, I'm aware that you've heard from major scholars like Andy Carroll. But here are two perspectives I would share with you. The first is that in the biblical record, particularly in the Old Testament, Yahweh's purposes and designs repeatedly unfold within the experience of migration and dislocation. What I mean by this is that it is very often the case that the men and women who receive divine commissioning were, for the most part, individuals whose lives reflected displacement and the experience of being aliens or strangers in a foreign land. This is most evident in the lives of the patriarchs, but also other prominent figures like Moses, Daniel, Esther, and a host of other divine agents. The second insight I think we should take seriously, and this is really important, I feel, for our time, that the most significant missionary encounters in the biblical record, and I mean both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, involved migration. Migration often provided the central impetus for missionary engagement. You can check this out later at your leisure, but I will point this out to you that in almost every instance where non-Israelites recognize the lordship of Yahweh and turn to him in worship, migrant action is involved. You see this in the story of Naaman, of Daniel, Esther, even Jonah, and so on. This theme becomes even more prominent in the New Testament because the gospel writers leave us in no doubt that Jesus's life experiences were distinctively shaped by the experience of migration and travel. And then the spread of the Christian movement throughout the Roman Empire and beyond is inseparable from migration, migrant action, and migrant networks. In fact, we may be unaware that a significant proportion of the New Testament letters were written to predominantly immigrant congregations, especially Romans and First Peter. I'm saying all this to suggest that a biblical perspective should actually transform how we view today's global migration. And I believe that our inability to appreciate the missionary significance of these burgeoning migrant populations, especially in Western societies, is a reflection of our inattentiveness to the biblical record. And I would say also a long history of misreading history. I'll say what I mean in a moment. So for the rest of this presentation, I want to explore these three issues. First, the need for rethinking the history of Christianity, I mean in the light of migration. Second, migration and our new world order. And third, migration in the shadow of Christendom. And the map I've added to the slide simply makes a point others have made earlier. It captures this epochal or phenomenal shift of Christianity to southern continents. So let's take the first point. Rethinking the history of Christianity is something I've spent a lot of time discussing in recent years. Now, remember, I pointed out earlier that all the major world religions fundamentally owe the worldwide spread of their belief systems to migrant movement or migration of peoples. And I also added that Christianity is a primary exhibit of the role of migration in the global expansion of faith. If these things are true, they raise an obvious question. If human migration has been consequential for human development and largely accounts for the global religious landscape, why is the theme of human migration so conspicuously absent from historical accounts of Christianity? What accounts for this profound silence or neglect? You know that there are literally hundreds of published volumes and printed texts that provide detailed assessment of the history and global spread of Christianity. And I'm just talking about those in English. I'm sure in Russian, Ukrainian, and other languages represented in this group, there are many more volumes. Some of you might even think that there are perhaps too many volumes on the history of Christianity. And some of you have impressive libraries with personal book collections that include historical accounts. These books have been used to train and educate generations of theological students, pastors, and academics. Many of them are written by top scholars or titans of historical research and knowledge. Feel free to think of your favorite church historian. These are powerful scholars and profound thinkers who have had significant impact on the historical study of Christianity. For the most part, they are silent on the role of migration. Now, I'm not saying this to discount the massive scholarly contributions of these scholars who have gone before us and on whose shoulders we all stand. What I have in mind is to draw attention not to the scholarly output of any one historian or the other, but historical discipline as a whole. Now, I suspect that there are probably quite a few historians on this Zoom presentation listening to me, so I have to be careful. But friends, the historical study of Christianity is dominated by Western scholars. Not only that, the historical study of Christianity has been shaped largely by the Western intellectual tradition. Now, there is no question about the immense value and impressive intellectual output of Western scholarship. That's not the issue. The issue actually is that it comes with blind spots and limitations that are seldom acknowledged. There is an obvious Eurocentrism in its assumptions and approaches. Those of you who use these books to train and teach students know that most texts prioritize Western heritage and experience. Most texts favor the study of Christianity as the development of Western doctrine and institutions. You know that almost every text you use uses historical periodization that casts developments outside the West as almost supplements or supplemental to the main narrative. I often have to remind my students that medieval, which is considered a major period in the study of Christianity, that medieval is a European category. It has no universal application. It cannot be applied to the history of Christianity in Africa or Asia or or elsewhere, but that often happens in the treatment of the history of Christianity. Now, I suspect that for some of you, these issues are well known and even widely acknowledged. But I want to go a little bit further and draw attention to a different aspect that has received little or no attention, but is equally entrenched, namely that the Western historical framework privileges structures of power or an interpretative model of history that is top down. And this is the model that I term the empire argument or empire logic. Okay? Empire argument, top down analytical framework, favors dramatic events, emphasizes structures of power, dominant or elite voices and contribution, institutional authority, and as you will note, when I talk about prominent, powerful individuals in historical accounts, they are usually male. Here is how one Western historian describes the issue. This is Philip Curtin. He wrote, Western historians have often concentrated on the doings of great men, top nations, or great civilizations, unconsciously setting aside the activities of women, the ordinary run of men, or societies whose achievements failed to attract Western admiration. So this should be familiar to most, if not all of you. The Western approach to history emphasizes dramatic events and the exploits of powerful individuals. And the emphasis is structured around major development, treatises, tribunals, the triumphs of one group or the other, conquest of one segment over another. Now, the issue here is this top-down view of historical processes is especially prominent in texts that attempt to account for the global spread of religion or the global spread of Christianity. So that the dominant structures, use of power, political ambition, superior resources, economic self-interest, and military conquest are prevalent and dominant themes in the historical sources and texts that we use. I want to be clear. All these are legitimate themes and ideas. These are elements that are often present in the story and provide important explanation. The point I wish to make is that the dominance of this empire construct or logic can obscure and, from a non-Western perspective, can even mislead. It has a contribution to make. But friends, history, it's not simply a series of dramatic events. It's not simply a story that accounts for the exploits and contributions of powerful individuals or the sizable impact of institutions. Not every major social transformation can be explained in terms of hegemonic power or political forces. So however useful this interpretative approach is, however useful the logic of empire is in historical study, it does not give us access to the whole account or to the whole story. It can explain some things, but not others. So this brings me to why we're here. Empire logic leaves many critical historical elements unaccounted for. By design, it minimizes commonplace experiences like migration. By design, it largely ignores or overlooks the impact of ordinary peoples, marginalized groups, or groups out of power. Friends, you see, in all ages, ordinary people, including migrant outsiders, can function as agents of historical change or contribute to wider historical processes. But discerning their impact and contribution requires a more bottom-up approach that attends to wider developments shaping human experience. And so I've spent decades, in my study of world Christianity, trying to introduce a more bottom-up analytical framework in historical study. And I want to say to you that in my experience, applying migration as a lens for historical study provides, in my view, a more comprehensive and meaningful account of Christianity as a global religion and lived faith. In fact, this can also undermine key assumptions in the study of mission. So in over 2 decades of research and study, I have made the case that migration was pivotal to the global spread of Christianity from the earliest beginnings, that the migration of Christians have been a prominent contributing factor to the globalization of the faith for the simple reason that every Christian migrant is in fact a potential missionary. So in my recent volume, Assessing the Global Spread of Christianity in the First 15 Centuries, I concluded that agents that are commonly considered indispensable for global Christian expansion actually played a minimal role. That the rise of Christianity as a world movement was predominantly through the agency and activity of migrants, individuals and communities living as strangers and outsiders in foreign lands. Okay, so that's my first point. Let's get to the second one. Migration and a new world order. I actually believe that if we embrace the thinking that every Christian migrant is in fact a potential missionary, this will have far-reaching implications for missiological thinking and practice. But no less than historical study, the study of Christian missions is also captive to Western constructs and Eurocentric approaches, maybe less so, and maybe less so now than, say, 20, 30 years ago. But it's still an issue. There's still a silence, there's still a gap. The vast literature on the Western missionary movement, for instance, which rose in the 16th century and ebbed by the mid-20th century, that literature makes scant reference to the crucial role of migration or migrant flows in that phenomenal movement. Yet, Western foreign missions from the 16th to the mid-20th centuries coincided with the largest human migration movement in history up to that point. As you can see on the slide, from 1800 to 1925, between 50 and 60 million Europeans, that was 1 in 5 Europeans, moved to overseas destinations. Most importantly, this movement of Europeans coincided, as I mentioned, with the most extensive human migration in history. So the largest, most phenomenal movement of missionary activity coincided, overlapped directly with the largest human migration movement at that point. And make no mistake, individual European missionaries or groups that went out were migrant outsiders in every sense of the term. Then I can spend much time exploring why there is this silence. I've already done that for the study of the history of Christianity. I don't want to do so here. But I suspect, if you allow me to say, that one reason, just one among others, why assessments of the Western missionary movement miss the migrant factor and continue to do so to this day has to do with the strange reluctance among Western scholars to apply the term migrant or migration to the movement of white people and populations. You see this again and again in historical texts. The earliest European settlers in the US are described in history books not as migrants, but as colonialists. The term immigrant is reserved for those who came after them. In our own time, Westerners who settle in foreign countries are almost always referred to as expats. It's an English word, spelled E-X-P-A-T, expats. They're not described as immigrants. They're not called economic or labor. They're not called economic or labor migrants. In the media, in news analysis, or in text, the term migrant and migrant crisis and so on, those labels are almost always reserved for the movements of people from outside the West or outside the European world. Okay, still, the basic fact remains that the Western missionary movement, and I refer to it because it's the best known, the Western European movement demonstrated how global migrations have historically shaped the church's mission. And once we understand that, it becomes much easier, missiologically speaking, to appreciate that the current age of global migrations incorporates patterns and dynamics that point to the unfolding of missionary movement of a scale and substance without precedent in the history of Christianity. Let me explain. So, the data we have on the proportion of Christians among the world's international migrants shows a consistent pattern going all the way back to 1990. Christians have consistently made up a greater proportion of the world's migrants than any other religion or religious group. And so the latest data we have from 2020 confirms that Christians make up slightly less than 50% of the world's international migrants. That's the highest of any religious group. The proportion of Muslims, which come up second, is considerably lower, 29%, compared to 47% for Christians. In total, there are 131 million, look at the graph on the left, 131 million Christian migrants in the world. Again, in sharp contrast to Muslim migrants. I'm going to move to another slide now because I want to point out the implications for Western societies and destinations. So, according to that analysis, Christians are the dominant migrant group settling in Europe and North America. So 56% of all migrants in Europe are Christian. compared to 18% Muslims. For some of you, I'm sure this is going to be very surprising, because in media accounts and coverage of migration, in Europe in particular, there is pronounced emphasis on Muslim migration. And of course, North America, even higher, 68% of all migrants are Christian. We don't have time to unpack this fully, but I want to say this to you. The impact of this extensive Christian migration is already evident in major cities in Europe and North America. Immigrant congregations, especially those established by African migrants, maybe I'm biased, continue to multiply in urban settings in the Western world. London is the most religious city in England because of immigration. People of African descent account for only 14% of London's population, but are reported to make up 60% of church attendance in the city. Because some of you might already know that the largest congregation in the UK is Kingsway International Christian Center. And many of you probably already know that the largest church in Europe has long been Embassy for the Blessed Kingdom of God, established by another Nigerian, Sunday Adelaja. But this is not a story about African immigrants. Britain attracts many Filipino nurses, 86% of whom are Christian. When Hong Kong was handed back to China, this led in 2022 to an influx of immigrants from Hong Kong, which saw a significant growth in Cantonese-speaking congregations in Britain. They actually at least doubled in size. Those of you located in other European cities or in North America, I'm sure can give more examples from your own context. Friends, the level of global Christian migration in our time is unprecedented in the history of Christianity. I can think of no other comparable movement in the historical record based on my research and study that comes even close. And assessing the importance, the implications of these remarkable developments for Christian witness or for the global church is one of the greatest missiological challenges of our time. I would argue that the implications and complications, let's be honest, for churches in US, in North America and Europe, the implications in terms of Christian witness, ministry, public engagement is the highest it has ever been for more than a generation. This is something that must command the attention of every committed Christian, church leader, and missiologist. My second point. So I don't know how I'm doing for time, but we're on my third and last point. And this point is going to take a little longer than the previous two, but I'm sure the moderator would let me know when I need to stop. Allow me to briefly reference the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm sorry for those of you who might be sensitive because the impacts of this calamity may still be felt within your households or within your families. Remember, the pandemic erupted in a world already marked by a tidal wave of international migrants. And for a while, at least, it looked like global mobility would never be the same again. In a matter of weeks, at least 174 countries had implemented travel bans and border closures. By May 2020, not March, as you see on the slide, by May 2020, 90% of the world's population lived in countries with largely closed borders. And so for a while, it seemed like pandemic restrictions would shut down the world and halt international migration indefinitely. Friends, nothing could be further from the truth. In hindsight, the COVID-19 pandemic has contributed to 3 ongoing trends. Let me cover this very quickly. The first, the pandemic demonstrated that human migration is irrepressible. By this I mean that even in the face of unprecedented global travel restrictions, the challenges surrounding global migrations did not go away. The crisis of mass mobility and the calamitous displacement of peoples did not cease. Here are some examples. Throughout the time of the pandemic, throughout 2020 to 2021, there were unprecedented movements of peoples taking place in parts of the world that were not being covered by the media. Of course, until we get to the Ukrainian event. You can see in Sahel, Africa, millions of people were displaced during that time. You would all remember the withdrawal of the US military from Afghanistan, which triggered massive wave of migrant movements and evacuations in the midst of the pandemic. And of course, then came Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 that set off the fastest mass migration in Europe in at least 3 decades. And it has continued. A year later, in April 2023, bloody conflict would erupt in Sudan that would trigger the world's fastest growing displacement crisis. In fact, by May 2023, or rather in May 2023, the year leading up to that was the largest ever single year increase in forced displacement in the history of the UNHCR. And this was before the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel in October 2023, which set off another large-scale destruction and dislocation in a region that was already experiencing extensive people displacements since the 2011 Arab uprisings and the Syrian civil war. I'm not going to read this statement, but in 2024, this statement by the UNHCR confirmed that that year, 2024, saw unprecedented crises and disasters that forced huge numbers of people to flee their homes, hundreds of millions, in fact. So the pandemic did not stop, halt, or change the basic dynamic of unprecedented human mobility in our time. Actually, not only did human mobility not cease, in fact, international migration surged after, well, not after, has surged since the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but let me give you some examples. By May 2023, in wealthy nations, the foreign-born population was rising faster than ever before. Anti-immigration was one of the most powerful impulses behind Brexit. Yet post-Brexit, as you can see, the graph on the left in the slide, experienced unprecedented migration from other parts of the world. In 2022, an estimated 1.2 million moved to Britain, the most ever in recent memory. You can move on to the US border. 2023, 2.5 million migrant encounters, which was the highest ever on record. And then Canada would receive record-breaking number of migrants also in 2022. There are many, many more examples. These are just to kind of make the point. And having made the point, friends, let me be clear. I'm pointing to a massive rise in the foreign-born population in wealthy countries. I'm not suggesting that that accounts for all of human mobility. In fact, please note this point I'm going to put on the screen now. 85% of the world's displaced people are hosted in developing countries. Okay, so I'm focusing on Western societies because of the missiological implications I want to address. But in any case, my point is that the global pandemic failed to stem international mobility in the long term, and in fact, as the economists would declare in May 2023, a new wave of mass migration began. Okay, so that's the first major trend of the pandemic. The second is the pandemic radicalized anti-immigrant attitudes. You see, for immigrant populations throughout the world, but especially in Western societies, the pandemic intensified aspects of life that were already a source of anguish and pain for immigrants. From the beginning, it's galvanized pre-existing anti-immigrant sentiments, intensified suspicion of foreigners around the world. In Europe and North America, reports of racism, discrimination, verbal abuse in public of people who are foreign-looking quickly mounted. Here in the US, in one 3-month period in 2020, over 2,000 anti-Asian American hate incidents were reported. And in many countries, rising unemployment deepened hostility towards immigrant populations. So anti-immigration rose along with this rise in global mobility. And in fact, I would say this is one unique feature of this age of migration, that the phenomenal rise in human mobility has gone hand in hand with an intensification of anti-immigrant attitudes and measures worldwide. So in an age when more people are on the move than ever before, antipathy towards immigrants is also pervasive. I want to be clear that immigrants face hostility and hardship throughout the world, even in developing countries. And so this is not limited to wealthy nations by any stretch of the imagination. That being said, my view is that anti-immigration is a more prominent phenomenon in Western nations for at least 3 reasons. One, it is more specifically anti-non-white immigration. 2, it constantly fuels public debate. And 3, within Western countries, it tends to impact electoral politics more decisively. And so when I give you those slides, when I share slides about a new rise in migration movement in the wake of the pandemic, or a new wave of mass migration, I need to also say that that wave immediately triggered an extensive backlash. And you've seen this in many countries. In the UK, tougher visa rules were introduced. Sweden used to be a poster child of welcome for immigrants. There too, new measures were put in place to reduce or limit immigration. Canada, another country that has been seen as a favorite for immigrants, also began to turn in terms of attitudes as many Canadians came to the view that the country has too many migrants. The case of the US is well known to you, I'm sure. In 2024, polls show that 55%, more than half of US adults would like to see immigration to the US decreased. This is important because that's the highest percentage recorded since the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And of course, where we are now is well known to most of you. Within the new Trump administration, mass deportation of immigrants, undocumented or otherwise, has been a central theme of the administration. It has already defunded refugee settlement programs. It's implemented draconian policies in its efforts to remove immigrants from the country. And of course, all of this culminated in the June 4 travel ban on, I believe, 19 countries, with more apparently being contemplated. So the point is that one of the long-term trends of the COVID-19 pandemic has been a rise in anti-immigration. The final point is the rise of Christian nationalism. So, friends, the COVID-19 pandemic bolstered a rising trend towards nationalism globally. The imposition of border closures emphasized territorial protection. The race to access vaccine supplies and diagnostic kits unleashed international competition. Travel bans that I've mentioned earlier in the midst of the pandemic legitimized suspicion of foreigners and reinforced opposition to non-white immigration. And out of this emerged a new resurgence of white Christian nationalism. I'm running out of time. White Christian nationalism has received a lot of attention in recent coverage, in the media, interestingly enough, in scholarly accounts and so on. We don't have time to get into it too deeply, but on the slide, I want to draw your attention to some traits. It's actually ethno-religious. It equates Christian identity with whiteness and belonging. It is exclusionary. It conflates Christianity with conservative traditional values and a particular territory or homeland. It emphasizes dominion. It asserts the rights of Christians to rule. It actually calls for what is, we should say, is white Christian male domination of government and society. It often employs the language of restoration of the ideal of a Christian a nation that enshrines white cultural and political supremacy. And some of its most ardent supporters would connect these ideas to spiritual warfare and languages that many of you are familiar with. We may come back to this in the Q&A. You don't need me to tell you that the existence of white Christian nationalism in Europe and North America has deep historical roots. It's not a new phenomenon. In my view, it's a recurring fruit of Christendom, and it demonstrates the durability of Christendom ideals. In the history of the West, the integration of territory, national identity, and and Christian belonging have repeatedly kindled empire or an imperial vision, notions of a holy war. I'm deeply conscious that in this setting, the Russian invasion of Ukraine provides vivid demonstration of the point I'm making, even though that invasion has also revealed the role of the institutional church on both sides of empire. But I want to suggest to you that the most widespread manifestation of Christian nationalism in our time derives its power and prevalence to opposition to non-white immigration. One research finding in Europe revealed that, and I quote, this was in 2018, when the percentage of a given country's population, a given country in Europe, population reaches the point where it is composed of approximately 4 to 5% immigrants from outside the EU, nationalism becomes intertwined with religion. Okay. I'm going to skip the next two slides. They make points that I believe will already be familiar to you, that Christian the tendency to link being Christian with national identity is actually prevalent in Eastern Europe as well, and attitudes to immigrants might even be less tolerant in that context. In the US, same. Christian nationalism has been on the rise. Its resurgence is well documented here as well. It is endorsed or embraced, we're told, by 30% of Americans, and the details can keep coming. In this context, it is particularly notable that those who attend church regularly are more likely to embrace Christian nationalist sentiments. I want to add very quickly that this is not an attempt to characterize Christianity in Europe in Christian nationalist terms. It's important to say it is an obvious fact that in both Europe and North America, multitudes of churches, Christian ministries, and organizations are on the front lines of advocacy for refugees, and the front lines of providing vital services for migrants, lead the charge in addressing Christian nationalist ideas. We must acknowledge that. That being said, friends, the growing sympathy or support for convictions associated with Christian nationalism in our pews and pulpits can no longer be ignored and has significant missiological implications. Let me close. So, you would recall this slide. The significant proportion of migrants who are Christian. The fact that the church in Europe and North America has gained a combined total of 85 million new Christian believers through migration. The US, which is the chief destination of the world's international migrants, exemplifies this remarkable trend. Christians account for about 60 to 65% of the foreign-born population in the US. By even the most conservative estimate, some 30 million Christians have been added to the American church by 2021. This presence has huge implications for how we understand church and the future of Christianity in the West. And by the way, the Trump administration's pledge to carry out the largest deportation in US history has implication for this Christian migration presence. I don't want to dwell on this, but a recent study estimated that more than 10 million Christian immigrants present in the US are vulnerable to deportation. And that's 8% of all Christians in the country. That's one way to point out the implications of public policy, political attitudes and measures for Christian presence. But we're in some ways here more concerned about the issue of the global church and Christian witness. So I'll close with these comments. Christianity is the world's largest faith, in part because it is endlessly border crossing, and its message defies cultural captivity or regional representation. If Christians are present in each of the world's 239 plus countries today, migration is the main reason. The first group of Christians in every country or nation first heard the gospel either from migrant outsiders or from members of their community who are recent migrants. That's important to bear in mind. I often have to remind my own students here in the American context that every major denomination, with one exception, every major denomination in the US began as a group of immigrants meeting somewhere. Ultimately, for the global church, for many communities of faith throughout the world, migration is now at the heart of the most serious predicaments and challenges confronting Christians and congregations. There can be little doubt that concerns about immigration and challenges of cultural integration will persist in Western societies for the foreseeable future. The proportion of our citizens and neighbors who have immigrant background will continue to grow. But friends, the biblical account and historical study suggest that Christian immigrant communities potentially represent a vital element of God's equipping the church for effective witness, and typically helps the church to realize its full blessings and potential. I don't intend, and I think it would be a grave error, to romanticize this new age of migration. As I mentioned before, global migratory flows are both an expression and indictment of our broken world. But the fact remains that in Western societies today, massive immigration has brought Christians from diverse communities throughout the world into closer proximity than ever before. Yes, we must acknowledge the massive shift in the Christianity center of gravity to the south, but that is not, in many ways, the most significant demarcation. The most significant demarcation may well be the one between those same Christians and Western Christians in cities and towns and villages within the West itself. Now, there's no denying that these Christian immigrants often bring with them theological views, spiritual outlook and understandings that can create tensions with homegrown churches. But in my view, the long shadow of empire often shapes Western Christian attitudes and responses in ways that contradict the teachings of Christ, in ways that violate our common identity as family of believers present throughout the world as members of a radically different kingdom. And so I would say, in closing, the plight of migrants and the transformations associated with migrant influx response from Christians in every nation. That response would say a lot about our theology. How we respond would say something about our priorities, our commitments, our witness, and our understanding of divine purpose. For many of us, some corrections are needed, but any adjustment must start with the understanding that the church or community of faith does not belong to any one country or society or to any particular culture. The church belongs to Christ. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hanciles. Thank you for such an informative, insightful, and I would say a provocative presentation, because if you look in our chat, you will see reactions of some of our participants toward the statistics which you presented. I recall that when I encountered the book Global Christianity Contested Claims, probably over a decade ago, I was a little bit surprised to learn that the attitude of scholars toward the migratory processes in Europe were significantly different from what was presented in the news and in public narratives. So that is why it kind of, at least in conflict with what we used to hear from our speakers. We have a number of very interesting questions, and I would like to start with the one which I received from my colleague Valentin Sini, who is the president of Tavriskin Christian Institute. And his question reads as follows. If we begin with the hypothesis that Western civilization has traditionally viewed history through the lens of men, conquerors, and empires, how do you think Southern and Eastern civilizations have approached historical narrative? Do you suppose their perspective has been more holistic? What evidence supports this view? Thank you.
That's a very good question. So one of the reasons I, kind of criticize the Western intellectual tradition, even though I recognize its benefits and significant insights. One of the reasons I take it on is because it has exercised considerable influence even outside the West. So when you talk about, the scholars and historians, they're trying. That's one reason for the popularity, I would say, of post-colonial theory, which I'm also critical of, by the way. So they're trying to approach the historical accounts, the understanding of these encounters in ways that give significant attention to indigenous agency, to indigenous instincts, contribution, and ideas. I would say, for instance, Andrew Waltz's translation principle has helped us to understand, and also in the work of Lamin Saneh, help us to understand that in many ways, because of the necessity of translation, because we can only take on new ideas using our existing frameworks, that in fact, when we look at the history of Christian mission, our primary focus should be on the institutions, the religious traditions, the understandings that are present that predate the arrival of a foreign missionary, right? And so those are the kinds of correctives that have gained popularity around the world. But I want to say that it's not an issue of, one area of the world has one approach, another area of the world comes up with a different approach. I think we gain more when we integrate these approaches, when we see, say, a more empire logic approach, which contributes some insights as offering something to our understanding, and other approaches as also increasing the way we think. In fact, I think the major sort of Western worldview I push against is the assumption that there is a single explanation. That, I think, is the most important thing we need to guard against. That in fact, whatever approach, even if it's non-Western, whatever approach we privilege would only take us so far. It is by integrating as many of these understandings and approaches as possible in our training, in our classes, in our writing, in our scholarship, that we can claim to provide a more comprehensive coverage or understanding of history.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hanciles. A number of people are asking about the sources which you use for your statistics, and it would be great if you could share them with the participants, because quite a number of people were really surprised to see, especially proportions of Muslim and Christian migrants. And it's really, I think, challenging for them. So it would be great if you could share those sources. Martha Strickland.
Hang on, before you go on, first of all,
Yes.
shame on you if you're surprised. I said that as a joke. But on every slide, I try to give a short indication of the source so you can see it. I mean, the slides are limited, but I'll be happy to share with Xenia perhaps, a bibliography that covers the content.
Yeah, I think we can include the bibliography and share it with the participants, so Xenia can do that. Thank you very much. Martha Strickland, in her comment, says the impact of Christian immigrants in churches is interesting. Exploring this impact, do you see one impact to be a growing increase in indigenous churches across the West, or is there increasing diversity within the Western churches? I wonder if the Western church needs to do better at supporting indigenous churches instead of seemingly spending most of their time trying to diversify their congregations. Please describe your scholarly view on this. Thank you.
It's another very interesting and complicated question. So the rise of Christian immigrant of immigrant congregations, churches, and ministries throughout Western societies is significant, and they're often the most visible in certain towns or cities and so on. But the experiences and the nature of the encounters are complicated and they vary considerably. Their contexts were, especially within what are often referred to as mainline denominations, there's an openness because there's a sense of need. So for instance, Catholic dioceses and congregations in the US and in Europe are often more open to, say, integrating, say, African priests or receiving, Christian leaders and agents from other parts of the world. Other traditions may be more resistant to the presence of Christians. So that's one. So the attitudes vary considerably. What I would say is, and I'm sure there are many here who will attest, working closely with an immigrant Christian community or congregation takes a lot of work. It takes a huge amount of work. And pastors, homegrown pastors who are interested in that, have to be very careful and persist in the project. Having said that, the rewards are enormous. Okay, we have many examples and testimonies of how local Christian ministries, spirituality understandings have been transformed by integration and interaction with Christian immigrant groups. But, friends, in some contexts, the gap and tension between different Christian immigrant communities, that gap, that tension is stronger than the tension between those communities and the homegrown church. Okay, so that's why I say it's a complicated phenomenon. By and large, though, definitely in my own research in the U.S. and my study of what's going on in much of Europe, by and large, immigrant Christian communities find themselves in a context of alienation, of cultural rejection, of suspicion, and dismissal of their own spirituality, theological insights, and the like. So that's more predominant, more prevalent, and so that's why that's the issue that we need to think about and talk about. Ultimately, I concluded in my presentation with my deep conviction that when we make the effort as a global church to see these movements, this new presence, as part of God's gift to the church, not a threat, not a distraction, not a problem. The immigrants themselves don't see themselves as a problem or a distraction. And of course, they can make claims too that can be problematic about what their presence means. But if we walk through all of that, the noise, the problems, the debates, the tensions, the fruit is enormous. And I keep insisting that those of us who are always asking what God is doing in the world ignore migration. And I would say biblically and otherwise, that would be problematic. So the issue is not that we want to know what God is doing in the world. The issue is often that we disagree with God about what he is doing in the world. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this answer. I think the previous question and the next, they kind of come together. So I just read it, but it seems to me that you already addressed it. It's a question from Fabiana Brown. She says, Dr. Hanciles, thank you for your insightful explanation of how the diaspora can be a potential channel for mission work. My observation is that most diasporas primarily form ethnic churches, which are often perceived as ghetto churches. There seem to be few congregations with a transcultural impact. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this observation. How do you think we can work towards changing this reality? And I think you already, to some extent, kind of address that. But if you can add something, please feel free.
Oh yeah, I want to add. First of all, describing immigrant churches as ethnic churches is correct, but so are the homegrown churches. I mean, if you describe immigrant churches as ghetto churches, so are the homegrown churches. I mean, the fact of the matter is that Christians prefer to worship with people like themselves and in languages that they share. So that's a common experience of Christianity. In fact, sometimes when you see what people call a multi-ethnic church, it is socially homogeneous. Most people come from the middle class, or most people come from an economic strata that makes it easy for them to come together. So so we need to recognize that. But I think the more important missiological issue has to do with the key assumption, which I regard as problematic, that it is now up to these immigrant churches to conduct missions in Europe. In other words, they're now the missionary instrument. And we don't have time to go into that here. I am deeply critical of the notion of reverse mission, in part because it simply extrapolates from Western constructs and thinking including the assumption that mission is something you go somewhere else to do. It's geographically demarcated. To understand how mission is taking place, you focus on the actions of a foreign agent of a foreign. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Western missionaries did not, for all the significance of the Western missionary phenomenon, Western missionaries did not account for the establishment and growth of the church in the non-Western world. They were important pioneering agents. But the spread of Christianity in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere is the work of indigenous Christians, primarily. I mean, that's not to devalue the work of Western missionary agents who took the gospel at great sacrifice and showed courage and determination that, you know, we have to continue to acknowledge and respect in missiological treatment. But they don't account for the rise of the church in the non-Western world. With very few exceptions, most Christians in Africa, Asia, and Latin America first had the gospel from people like themselves who speak their language. The Western missionary movement, for all this thing, was just too small to be able to have that impact. And most did not even speak the languages very well. And if they did, could not get into the various dialects. So friends, the problem is not with how we're thinking about this Christian migrant movement today. The problem is the assumptions and perspectives or constructs we come with from our understanding of the Western missionary movement that need to be corrected. So I see all of that to say, the missionary impact, spiritual, ministerial contribution of this Christian immigrant communities will not be possible without full partnership, interaction, and engagement with homegrown Christians. So the greatest impediment in this work of mission, what we're saying, oh, this is what God is doing in the world, comes in two forms. Those immigrant Christians who think that, oh, they're now the answer to decline of Christianity in Western societies, that they are the answer. They discover very quickly that it's easier to claim that vision than to fulfill it. And those Western Christians who insist that these immigrant congregations are the answer, they are not. They are not. Christianity takes root and flourishes always on indigenous terms. The missionary outsider, the missionary migrant, brings in ingredients, brings in tools, perspectives, experience and enrichment that contributes to that process. That contribution is significant, is important, it must be acknowledged, and it must be received in partnership, as part of a family of faith. That's the main problem, actually. Not that it's going to be the thing that changes Western societies. No, there's no biblical historical basis for that assumption. And by the way, I'll say this lastly, I think it's a profound mistake to ignore what God is already doing in Western societies. Western missionaries made the same mistake. They didn't think God was already at work in those societies and those contexts. God is already working. I mean, God is not waiting for Christian migrants to arrive in Europe. God is already at work in Europe. There are many vital ministries, churches, projects, encounters that demonstrate God's power, especially in Europe and in North America. That power has to be demonstrated. It's already at work. And to the extent that the immigrant, Christian migrant phenomenon taps into and ties into that, to that extent, it becomes an agent in God's mission. Sorry, you touched on that question. Touched on something. I've done too many presentations on this, not to say more.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jehu Hanciles. Dear participants, I am afraid we don't have enough time to read all your questions. I really appreciate your activity, appreciate your engagement with the material presented. I appreciate your comments and your involvement. It is really, it means a lot. It means that we're discussing something really significant. So the last question, probably, and then Ksenia, up to you. Several people asked, are there specific reasons beyond that the movement that people, the movement to the UK, Canada, Europe, can we frame that as purely economic reasons or maybe some other reasons why? If you could just briefly, Dr. Hanciles, just briefly comment on that because we are running out of time. Thank you.
Sure. Friends, migrant movement is shaped by complex factors, calculations, motives, realities, and so on. And the movement is not just from poorer nations to wealthy nations. The movement is poorer nations. It's actually predominantly from poorer nations to poorer nations, predominantly. That's why I pointed out 85% of all displaced peoples are in the developing world. Yes, economic factors, economic aspirations often play a significant role. But fundamentally, no one leaves their homeland if they don't have to. So there are all kinds of pressures that propel movement and displacement, including Western movement and displacement. There are many expats, remember that term, that are in the non-Western world, are outside Europe, and for many reasons are they economic. And so yes, migrant movement is shaped by these very complex considerations. When I say that every Christian migrant is a potential missionary, I'm trying to capture the fact that the vast majority of this movement is not missionary induced. In other words, they don't leave their settings say, I'm going to go as a missionary somewhere. It's the ugliness, the brutality, the violence of our world that propels this movement. But because they're Christians, and because this has been true throughout the history of Christianity, people move throughout the Roman Empire for all kinds of reasons related to violence and economic aspirations. The same is true today. They move for all kinds of reasons, maybe even to study or to take advantage of opportunities elsewhere for their family or for health. The point is when they move as Christians, that opens up an entirely new situation for missionary engagement and interaction that is increasingly prominent and significant in our time as we look at the global church.
Dr. Hanciles, thank you very much for your insightful and rich presentation and interaction through Q&A session. Thank you for your time and for sharing part of your schedule with us.